Welcome everyone to the Sister Stories podcast. The aim of this podcast is to marvel at God's sovereignty over each of our lives as women and to encourage one another by sharing our stories. My name is Sophie and today I'm joined by Maggie.
Hello.
Hi. So Maggie, to start with, can you tell us who you are?
Yeah, I'm Maggie. I'm married to David and we have 3 children, 2 boys aged 11 and 18 and a 16-year-old girl. And I also, as well as being a mum and a wife, I work part-time as a community nurse.
Nice, great. So we're going to be talking about your journey with the Lord Jesus Christ. But to start with, could you tell us a bit about your family background?
Mm-hmm. I grew up in the New Forest, so quite a rural area in the south of England. I had both parents, a very stable home. I have one older sister, and we went to church every Sunday. We went to a local Methodist church, so this involved Sunday school from a young age and also main church meetings as well. So I grew up with that, really.
Right. And can you tell us a little bit more about the experience of church and home as well?
Mm-hmm. So church, I do remember Sunday school quite clearly. I remember stories about Jesus. I knew that he died for me. I was told that he died for me. But I didn't really know what that meant. And I think I had a lot of questions that I didn't feel I could ask. That was probably a mix of my personality. I was quite shy, still am. So not feeling I could ask questions. I also had a culture at home of not talking about spiritual things at all, which sounds quite strange, but church was part of the culture of the family. So on a Sunday we would go to church and then we would come home and never talk about anything to do with church. We might talk about individuals, but we'd never talk about spiritual things. And I think that was, my dad had a tough background. I think he grew up in a broken home. So a lot of things added into that. But I think also the era of you don't talk about politics and religion, that was very much what I grew up with. But I had church blended into that, which sounds really odd, but it was something we did. So certainly Sunday school, I remember hearing about turning over a new leaf. So that was something that I heard repeatedly on a Sunday, but I didn't know, I still don't know what they meant. And to me, I suppose a leaf meant a tree leaf. Mm-hmm. So somehow turning over a new leaf. Yeah. But I knew that meant every Sunday, okay, I had to make more effort. I knew Jesus had died for me. I didn't know how that worked. But I knew I was a sinner. So from quite a young age, I knew that I was a sinner. Turning over a new leaf was something that I had to try to do, but it was all to do with my own effort. And so I did have this, almost in my mind's eye, really, this pile of leaves building up that I knew didn't work, but I didn't know what the answer was. So every Monday I would make more effort. I would try to not sin, but I knew that, and I was quite a good girl, but I knew that the sin was in my heart. I wasn't openly really rebellious, but I knew I was a sinner, that I was under God's judgment. So I had that going on really, but nowhere to go with those questions. Yeah.
So did that translate into you just doing things that you knew were right and wanting to strive for that goodness and these works?
Yeah, I think so. Sort of probably, maybe being quite a good girl was something that was part of my identity, I think, of being known to be so-called good. But it didn't help the heart because I knew that the heart was wrong. I knew I was selfish. I knew, all of those heart things. So I think I was quite intense, probably, in that I had all these questions with nowhere to go.
Did you have examples, models, I guess, around you in the church or in your friends or people who were responding who were able to respond to that, in a sense of like showing you a model of someone who is striving to be good, but also has that other side of the answer, in the sense of actually knowing to go to Christ and what to do with that. I'm not
sure I had that. I think I look back now, my parents still live in the area I grew up, and I know individuals that were in the church who were youth leaders. I know them now, and I think they were really genuinely, well, it feels like they were trying to help, but church culture was such that it was mainly social stuff that the youth group would be doing. It wasn't, any Bible stuff was really picking out individual verses from places and no in-depth study. It was very shallow. So that was something that I just didn't have the answer to. It was a puzzle, but I had nowhere to go. So I think there were people modelling church in a sense, but it wasn't there weren't conversations being had or any in-depth understanding that I had at all.
I wonder what your perception of God was, because that obviously we've gone for the more individual side of it, but what did you, maybe you don't remember or are not sure, but did you feel that you could relate to him as a father, as your saviour, or not really?
No, not really. I think I felt fearful. There were certain things I'd read where I knew I was under judgment. And one thing that sticks in my mind is, so we had visiting preachers. We had a lot of lay preachers, so people within the circuit. So it was a big, what they used to call a circuit of churches. So it was a rural area. There were about 12 churches, and people would go between churches and preach. So there was never a series. There were just individual sermons. But there was somebody that came from a Bible college in Bournemouth who would come and preach sometimes. And I remember him coming and preaching on the second coming. Now, he probably said a lot of really good things, but I do remember him saying, I may not finish this sermon because Jesus might come back. And that absolutely terrified me, because I felt like I knew that I wasn't right. I didn't have the answer. And he probably explained it, but in my child's mind, I don't know how old I was, maybe about 10 or 12, something like that. I just thought, I'm not going to be in that group that's saved.
And so that's quite a striking idea, isn't it? If you know that he's coming and you will judge, then
that's right.
It's not reassuring if you're not secure in your salvation.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that that really went on till I left home at 18, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when you did leave home, what changed and what happened?
So I went off to university at 18. I really was drifting. I would have said I was a Christian if I was, well, would I maybe have said I was a Christian? But I was drifting more by then. I think I'd lost the intensity of feeling like I was under judgment, maybe. I felt like, I'm okay, I'm better than a lot of other people. So had a bit of sort of shallow understanding about Jesus dying for me, no real relationship. And I left home at 18 to go to university with no intent. I think in the back of my mind I thought I'll find a church, but I would have found a Methodist church like I knew. That was all I knew. So I would have gone and found, well, I said in my mind I would have done that. But first Sunday came and went and I didn't, and I was sort of going along to fresher stuff. But really quite quickly in my hall I was aware of a girl who was a Christian who wasn't going along to all the bar, stuff that freshers became for me is, just the going along with the crowd. She was going to Christian Union stuff. And I can say it just so happened. I know it was God's providence and kindness. But I was having breakfast one day. I remember it was one of the first weekends, and she came and sat with me. We hadn't spoken before, and she just clearly said she was going to church the next day and was having a lift. So there was a little journey to the church she was going. So I just asked to go along as well, just because I didn't have any better idea. But there was something very attractive about her because she was clearly knew what she wanted to do. She wanted to be a Christian. She wanted to, but I'd never seen that before. I'd never seen that sort of sort of person who was intentional about it. So that,
Wow.
So I tagged along.
Yeah. So do you know what was her background? Was she?
So her background was Christian family, evangelical church. So that was her background. Yeah.
Okay. That's really interesting how she just kind of zeroed in
onto
you. Great. And so was that experience of church different?
Very different. So, I mean, we're going back to this is the late 80s. And the culture, she would wear different clothes to church. I'm not sure it would be like that now. But that in itself was different. But just going in, it was quite a formal. It was an evangelical church. I'd never heard that word before, and I thought it sounded a bit weird and cultish. To be honest, I thought, "What's evangelical? I don't know. I didn't have a clue." But I was immediately struck by the seriousness of the place. It was a place where God's word was taken seriously, and it was a sort of preaching where it was mainly one pastor doing the preaching morning and evening, and it would be literally one verse a week.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it took 3 years to get through the book of Ephesians. It'd be it would literally be one verse. Yeah. And that sort of systematic preaching, which I'd never come across before, but it was absolutely eye-opening for me. Really, really significant. Yeah.
Yeah. So is it through that church and potentially the CU that you started learning more?
Yeah, definitely. And I think so that church, so it was Philippians and then Ephesians, I remember, during my university years. And then in the evening, they'd always do a gospel preach. So it would be the same person preaching morning and evening, but he would do an evangelical, evangelistic preach in the evening particularly. So I remember one sermon in particular where it was Matthew 22, where it was about the wedding banquet, and the bit at the end really about the person in the wrong clothes. Now that really struck me because all those years where I'd tried by my own effort to be good enough and to be acceptable to God, but the man was in the wrong clothes and he was cast out. He wasn't allowed into the banquet in the end. He was thrown out. So it was really to do with the righteousness of Christ. It has to be his clothes. That has to be. So it was years of not understanding, and then it was clicking in. It was sort of building up and clicking into place. Yeah.
Were these passages that you had read for yourself before and not understood, or were they completely new to you?
Yeah, maybe I had, but certainly my eyes were opened. I would say that I maybe had read them before, probably had, but hadn't seen it. But also I think having grown up with so much fear and then understanding it's not just the answer to my fear, but actually loving Jesus. So Christ is, I need to love him. It's not all to do with he's the answer to me not going to hell. It's to do with understanding that it's Jesus. He has to be the focus of my heart and my love, really. Yeah.
And it's very different between. So that is different. That is very different from just doing things because it's a tradition or because it's what you're meant to do, isn't it? And then you have the real picture of why you should be doing these things.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Yeah. Great. So I assume that's when you really came to understand the gospel in that time. So
in lots of ways, I would say I became a Christian at university, but I think looking back, I can see God's hand in my life from a young age. Yeah. So in a sense, not knowing the exact time doesn't matter. Yeah, I can look back and see that certainly God was working in my life as a child. And
I think as well, in a sense, even if it wasn't complete understanding in your childhood, you need to understand that you're a sinner. So even just understanding that from a young age, a lot of us nowadays would not have that notion at all in our culture. So if you don't understand you're a sinner, you won't understand why you need Jesus. So in a sense, you're right. He's kind of sown little seeds in your life along the way, hasn't he? Yeah, definitely. Great. So quite a few years have passed since then, I'm afraid. Sorry. Can you take us through the next few years and how things developed for you and how you came to Kingston and all of that?
Okay. So I moved around to different locations really after university. I did a year working for a church in Oxford. I then moved home for a little while, probably 6 months. I was going to a different, I'd chosen to go to a different church by then. And then I moved to Nottingham, did my nurse training. I sort of knew by then the churches to seek out, I suppose. Had different church experiences in those places, definitely, but was then in churches that preached the Bible consistently, and then ended up moving to quite near here, so sort of Chessington, Epsom direction for my first job as a nurse. So that was late 90s, so quite a long time ago.
How did you and David meet?
So that was Chessington Church. So we were at Chessington Church for quite a few years. So met there. We were doing so that was the first time I'd sort of studied Romans systematically, I would say, and David was the Bible study leader.
I see. Right.
Yeah.
And how long have you been married now?
21 years. 21 years. Yeah.
Nice. Great. So did you then move to Cornerstone?
So when Cornerstone started, so it was called Fairfield. So there were a few of us from Chessington that were asked to come, so Peter Nan as well, and a few others. So we came then, to Fairfield. That became Cornerstone.
Yeah, and then stuck around.
Stuck around.
Nice, that's great. Are you involved in the Sunday school?
That's right.
That's right.
And that's been an amazing thing in a way that I can. And one of the good things about getting older, so I'm now in my 50s, is looking back and seeing how God's used certain things. Sometimes you don't see it at the time, but because I grew up with the type of Sunday school where we'd hear stories about Jesus, but not with any particular in-depth teaching, I suppose. I can see that, and then the church experience I had at uni, where it was very detailed, and then being able to do Sunday school, where you take a step. Well, we do Bible overview stuff, don't we? As in going through the Bible with stories and seeing the bigger picture of salvation. So that was something that so studying Romans at Chessington was significant. I would say Bible overview there we did as well, which was significant. But doing Sunday school as well as the week in, week out preaching, that's helped me because it's taught me what I feel I missed as a child. It's built up that bigger picture.
I find the same when preparing it. You just learn so much from it as well, and being able to then explain when you have to explain it to a child is very different as well, isn't it? That's great. If we go to more recent times, I guess this was fairly recent anyway. But what would you say you've learned in the last year or so?
So something we have looked at, particularly as a home group, is the subject of forgiveness. And Jesus is very clear that we should forgive others as we have been forgiven. But I think we've looked at that in depth, and we've looked at it with certain bigger stories on Christian forgiveness, and realising, I suppose it's realising that yes, we should forgive others. That's what Jesus tells us to do, but it needs to come from a heart of wanting good in the person that you are forgiving and wanting the best for them. It's not just to do with gritting your teeth and sort of feeling like you should. Yes. But it's really what's coming from a heart of wanting good for them. And it would only be possible, it is only possible by God's help. And it's only possible if we really believe that we're forgiven by grace alone, that actually, you know, we are forgiven by God, and that's not deserved. So that's been quite significant, because I don't think it's, you know, we looked at big stories of people forgiving the murderers of their children and things like that. But often in normal daily life, it's those little niggles that often eat away or can be harboured in our hearts, I think. But it's sort of looking at the fact that we should be forgiving because we're forgiven.
Yeah. That's a great lesson to learn, isn't
it?
It's a hard one.
Yes, it is a hard one. And it's not something that I think you just tick off and you've done it. It's something you have to keep coming back to the Lord with. Yes. That, you know, it's something that comes back to you sometimes. You think, you know, it's a process that you have to keep doing. Yeah. Yeah,
and that's very important in the context of church, isn't it? Because we all together all the time.
That's right. So. Yeah, and that's where those little niggles, I think, can eat away. And it's really important that we question our hearts and, have we really forgiven that person? Yeah.
Yeah, right. And what advice would you give to younger Christians, as a mom or as a slightly older Christian, more experienced?
I think it feeds into what I've talked about today, really, of having relationships around you where you can be real and where you can ask questions of, and who you become vulnerable with. And that won't be lots of people, but I think it's quite easy in church life to have lots of quite superficial relationships, to know a lot of people a bit, but it's having people, and it will and should be your spouse, but it should also be a few others, actually, where you are real with, where you can ask questions of. Because I know different stages of my life, I look back and the Lord gave me different people, different ages as well, of people who I could share life with and do normal things with, and but be able to have those conversations. And
Yeah, actually I was thinking we haven't really talked about your children or being a mum for you, but I'm sure people can come and ask you about that if they want to. But I wonder whether for your children, whether that's actually a great example to see as well, and to be in a church where they do mix with a lot of different ages. I certainly try to talk to Joshua quite a lot, actually, when I see him. So although he's still very quiet, but it's nice to be able to talk to him. I wonder whether they've experienced that in the church, actually, and what it's been for them.
I think so. And I think it's different because church is family, isn't it? And it's different ages. And so home group lends itself to that, I think, which is where we do church on a smaller level, I think, of relationships. That's where that should be happening, I think, is those relationships. So they're quite used to seeing the older members of the home group, you know, in our house regularly, and others as well. But yeah, I think they've had an upbringing where things are talked about more openly than I had, and so my parents, you know, they're still around. They see that, so I think that is something that is different for them as well. Yeah,
that's great. Excellent. Thank you very much, Maggie, for sharing your story with us. And thanks everyone for listening. That's all for today's episode of Sister Stories, but join us again next time.